The afternoon sun beat mercilessly down on the weathered wooden platform of Copper Creek Station, turning the air into shimmering waves of heat. Sarah Beth Mackenzie clutched her 3-month-old son closer to her chest, feeling his tiny body grow limp with exhaustion in the oppressive Arizona Territory heat. Her once pristine blue calico dress was now stained with dust, and the baby's spit up, telling the story of 3 days spent waiting for a train that might never come. "Please, little one," she whispered, against Thomas's damp forehead. Her voice cracked from thirst. "Just hold on a little longer." The station master had made it clear that morning. No more charity. She had exactly until sundown to produce the fare to Denver, or she and her baby would be thrown off the platform. Sarah Beth's trembling fingers counted the coins in her small leather purse for the 100th time. 37 cents. Not nearly enough for 2 tickets to anywhere, let alone to her sister's homestead in Colorado. Behind her, the saloon doors of the Broken Wheels swung open, releasing a wave of raucous laughter and the smell of whiskey and unwashed bodies. 3 men stumbled out, their eyes immediately finding her sitting alone on the bench. "Well, well," drawled the tallest one, his voice thick with alcohol. "Looks like we got ourselves a lost little dove." Sarah Beth's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd learned to recognize that particular tone in a man's voice, the same one her late husband's creditors had used when they'd come to collect what she couldn't pay. She pulled Thomas closer and shifted toward the far end of the bench. "Now don't be unfriendly," the man continued, swaggering closer. "Name's Buck Morris, and these here are my associates. We might be able to help a lady in distress." "I'm fine, thank you," Sarah Beth managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Buck's companions flanked her bench, cutting off any escape route. "Don't look fine to me. You look like a woman who needs protection. This territory's dangerous for a lady traveling alone." "The baby's crying," observed the second man, a wiry fellow with gold teeth. "Probably hungry. Mama probably is too." Sarah Beth's stomach clenched. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, and her milk was running thin. Thomas began to fuss, his weak cries piercing the desert air. "I have a proposition," Buck said, sitting heavily beside her despite her attempt to scoot away. "You come with us. We'll make sure you and the little one are taken care of." The way he said it made Sarah Beth's skin crawl. She knew exactly what kind of care men like Buck Morrison provided. "No, thank you. I'm waiting for someone." "Who?" Buck's eyes narrowed. "Been watching you for 3 days, honey. Ain't nobody coming for you." Thomas's cries grew more desperate, and Sarah Beth felt tears burn her eyes. Buck was right. Nobody was coming. Her husband was dead, killed in a mining accident that had left her with nothing but debts. Her family back in Missouri had disowned her when she'd married against their wishes. Her sister in Colorado didn't even know she existed, didn't know their father had remarried after their mother's death. "Look," Buck's voice took on a false kindness that was somehow worse than his earlier threat. "I run a boarding house in town, clean rooms, regular meals. All I ask is that you help with the hospitality." Sarah Beth's blood turned to ice. She understood perfectly what he meant. She pulled Thomas against her chest, feeling his tiny heart racing against hers. "Please," she whispered, "leave us alone." Buck's patience evaporated. His hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. "You listen to me, you little—" "The lady asked you to leave." The voice was quiet, but it cut through the desert air like a blade. All 4 of them turned to see a man standing in the shadow of the station house. He was tall and lean, dressed in worn leather pants and a cotton shirt that had seen better days. His black hair hung past his shoulders, and his dark eyes held a stillness that made Buck's hand loosen on Sarah Beth's wrist. "This ain't your business, Apache," Buck snarled, but Sarah Beth heard the uncertainty creeping into his voice. The stranger stepped forward, and Sarah Beth saw the knife at his belt, the way he moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to violence. "I'm making it my business." For a moment, the desert air crackled with tension. Thomas had stopped crying, as if even he sensed the danger. Then Buck released Sarah Beth's wrist and stood, his companions backing up a step. "This ain't over," Buck warned, but he was already retreating. "Town's got laws about your kind mixing with white women." The Apache man said nothing, just watched until the three men disappeared around the corner toward town. Only then did he turn his attention to Sarah Beth, who was staring at him with a mixture of fear and desperate gratitude. "Thank you," she breathed. He studied her for a long moment, taking in her obvious exhaustion, the baby's weak movements, the empty water canteen at her feet. When he spoke, his English was careful but clear. "You have no place to go." It wasn't a question. Sarah Beth felt her carefully maintained composure finally crack. "No," she admitted, tears spilling down her dusty cheeks. "I have nothing. I'm nothing." Thomas began to cry again, a thin, hungry wail that tore at her heart. The stranger looked at the baby, then back at her face. "My name is Ayana," he said finally. "In your language it means eternal blossom, but the white men call me Joseph." "Sarah Beth," she managed. "And this is Thomas." Joseph nodded slowly. "There is a place. Not far. Clean water. Food." He paused, studying her face. "But it is not what you know. Not your people's way." Sarah Beth looked down at Thomas, whose cries were growing weaker. She thought of Buck Morrison's boarding house, of the long, empty miles of desert stretching in every direction, of the 37 cents that wouldn't buy them even one night in a decent hotel. "Will we be safe?" she asked. Joseph's dark eyes met hers. "With me, yes. You will be safe." Something in his voice, a quiet certainty that had nothing to do with boasting, made her believe him. Sarah Beth looked once more at the empty train tracks, at the harsh town where men like Buck Morrison waited, at her son's pale, hungry face. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." Joseph nodded and moved to gather her small bundle of possessions. As he helped her to her feet, Sarah Beth felt the weight of her old life falling away like dust in the desert wind. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in months, she felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. Behind them, the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky the color of fire and promise. The journey took them away from the main road and into country Sarah Beth had never imagined existed. Joseph led her on foot along a narrow trail that wound between towering red rock formations, their surfaces carved into fantastic shapes by wind and time. The air grew cooler as they climbed, and Sarah Beth found herself breathing easier for the first time in days. Thomas had fallen into an exhausted sleep against her shoulder, but she could feel how light he'd become, how his small body seemed to be consuming itself. Fear gnawed at her as steadily as hunger. "How much further?" she asked, trying to keep the desperation from her voice. Joseph glanced back at her, noting how she favored her left foot, how her breathing had become labored. "Close now. You need rest." Before she could protest that she was fine, he stopped beside a small spring that bubbled up from the rocks. The water was crystal clear and surprisingly cold. Joseph cupped his hands and offered her the first drink. "Thank you," Sarah Beth whispered, then realized she'd been saying those words to this man all afternoon. "I'm sorry. Do not apologize for gratitude," Joseph said quietly. "It is a gift both ways." As she drank, Sarah Beth studied his face in the golden afternoon light. His features were strong and angular, marked by a thin scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. His hands, she noticed, were gentle despite their obvious strength, scarred from work but clean and careful. "You speak English very well," she ventured. "Mission school," Joseph replied, settling beside the spring to refill her canteen. Many years ago. Something in his tone warned her not to ask more, but she found herself curious despite her exhaustion. This man had appeared from nowhere to save her, was leading her to safety without asking for anything in return. In her experience, men always wanted something. As if reading her thoughts, Joseph stood and shouldered her bundle again. "Come, before dark." The trail crested a ridge, and Sarah Beth gasped. Spread before them was a hidden valley, green with cottonwoods and crossed by a silver stream. Smoke rose from the chimney of a small adobe house nestled against the far canyon wall, and she could see horses grazing in a natural meadow. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "My mother's people found this place long ago," Joseph explained as they descended. "Before the soldiers came, before the reservations." The words carried a weight of loss that made Sarah Beth's heart ache. "Do you live alone here?" "For 3 years now," Joseph answered. "Since—" He stopped, the sentence hanging unfinished in the air. The adobe house was larger than it had appeared from the ridge, with thick walls that would keep it cool in summer and warm in winter. A wide porch faced the stream, and Sarah Beth could see a garden plot where corn, beans, and squash grew in neat rows. "You built this yourself?" she asked. "My wife helped," Joseph said quietly, then moved quickly toward the house as if to escape the words. Sarah Beth followed more slowly, understanding dawning. His wife. Past tense. That explained the careful way he held his solitude, the hesitation before he'd offered to help her. Inside, the house was simple but comfortable. The main room held a table, chairs, and a large stone fireplace. Colorful woven rugs covered the floor, and the walls were whitewashed smooth. Everything was clean and well-maintained, but Sarah Beth could sense the emptiness, the careful order of a man living alone. "You should rest," Joseph said, indicating a wooden chair by the fireplace. "I will make food." "I can help," Sarah Beth began, but he was already moving toward what she assumed was the kitchen. "Rest," he repeated firmly. "You and the child need strength." Thomas stirred against her shoulder, making the soft mewing sounds that meant he was hungry. Sarah Beth's face burned with embarrassment as she realized her situation. She had no privacy, no way to nurse her son without. Joseph appeared in the kitchen doorway, as if sensing her distress. Without a word, he handed her a faded quilt and turned his back. "Thank you," Sarah Beth whispered, for what felt like the 100th time. As Thomas nursed, she studied the room more carefully. There were small details that spoke of a woman's presence. A vase that held dried wildflowers, curtains at the windows, a small weaving loom in one corner, but everything was covered with the fine layer of dust that spoke of disuse, of care abandoned. The smell of cooking food began to fill the house, something savory with corn and meat that made Sarah Beth's stomach clench with hunger. She couldn't remember the last time someone had cooked for her, the last time she'd felt safe enough to simply sit and rest. "Joseph," she called softly. "Yes? Why are you helping us? You don't know anything about me. I could be anyone." There was a long pause before he answered. "I know you are a mother protecting her child. I know you chose to trust a stranger rather than accept something that would harm you. I know you say thank you too much." She heard what might have been the ghost of a smile in his voice. "That is enough." Thomas finished nursing and fell back into sleep. Sarah Beth arranged the quilt around him and leaned back in the chair, feeling her own exhaustion pulling at her. For the first time in months, she felt safe enough to let her guard down. Joseph emerged from the kitchen, carrying 2 bowls and a cup of what smelled like mint tea. The stew was unlike anything she'd ever tasted, rich with meat and vegetables she couldn't identify, seasoned with herbs that seemed to ease the ache in her tired bones. "This is wonderful," she said, and meant it. Joseph nodded, eating his own meal in comfortable silence. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson. The stream murmured peacefully past the porch, and somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird was running through its evening repertoire. "Joseph," Sarah Beth said finally, setting down her empty bowl, "I need you to know I can't pay you. I have nothing to offer in return for this kindness." He looked at her steadily. "Did I ask for payment?" "No, but—" "Then do not burden yourself with debts that do not exist." Sarah Beth felt tears threatening again. "Men don't usually— in my experience—" "What is your experience?" The quiet question opened something in her chest that she'd kept carefully locked away. "My husband died 6 months ago. Mining accident up in Prescott. He'd borrowed money to buy equipment, money I didn't know about. When he died, the creditors came. They took everything, the house, the furniture, even my wedding ring. Joseph's expression didn't change, but she saw his hands tighten slightly on his bowl. I was pregnant, she continued, the words coming faster now. Had nowhere to go. The bank manager, he said he could help me, said he'd forgive the debt if I'd marry him. He was 60 years old and had buried 2 wives already. But you refused. I couldn't. Sarah Beth's voice dropped to a whisper. I tried to, but when Thomas was born and I had no food, no money for medicine when he got sick, I agreed. The wedding was supposed to be yesterday. Joseph set down his bowl carefully. What changed? Sarah Beth looked down at her sleeping son. I found out why his other wives died. A neighbor woman warned me. He hit them. The second one, she was pregnant when she died. Fell down the stairs, or so he claimed. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of the stream and Thomas's soft breathing. So I ran, Sarah Beth finished. Took what little I could carry and ran. I thought if I could get to Colorado, to my sister. But I didn't have enough money for the train. Joseph was quiet for so long that Sarah Beth began to wonder if she'd shocked him with her story. When he finally spoke, his voice was very soft. My wife's name was Ayana, the same as mine. We shared the name because we shared one heart. She died in childbirth 3 years ago. The baby... He stopped, swallowed hard. The baby lived only 2 days. Sarah Beth's heart clenched. I'm so sorry. The white doctor in town would not come. Said he did not treat Apache women, not even for money. By the time I could reach the medicine man on the reservation, it was too late. Joseph's voice was steady, but Sarah Beth could hear the pain beneath it. So yes, I know what it is to lose everything, to have nowhere to go. They sat in silence as true darkness fell outside. Thomas stirred and whimpered, and Sarah Beth adjusted the quilt around him. You can stay, Joseph said finally, as long as you need. There is a small room in the back where you and the child will have privacy. But the townspeople, what will they? The townspeople do not come here, Joseph interrupted. This valley is hidden, protected. You will be safe. Sarah Beth looked around the quiet house, at this man who had saved her from Buck Morrison's threats and asked nothing in return, who had shared his food and his painful memories with equal generosity. For a few days, she said carefully, until I can figure out what to do next. Joseph nodded, but something in his eyes suggested he understood, as she was beginning to, that some journeys didn't have a planned destination. Sometimes safety was found not in reaching a distant place, but in discovering that you were already home. 3 weeks passed like a gentle dream. Sarah Beth found herself settling into a rhythm she'd never experienced, days without fear, without the constant weight of desperation pressing on her chest. Thomas had grown stronger on her improved milk, his cheeks filling out and his eyes growing bright and curious. He'd even begun to smile, something that filled Sarah Beth with a joy so fierce it sometimes brought tears to her eyes. Joseph had given them the small back room as promised, but more than that, he'd given them peace. He never entered without permission, never made demands or suggestions about how long they might stay. He simply shared his home with the quiet generosity of someone who understood what it meant to need shelter. Sarah Beth had begun helping with the garden and the cooking, partly from a need to contribute and partly because she enjoyed the work. Joseph was a good teacher, showing her which plants were ready for harvest and how to prepare the corn in the traditional way his mother had taught him. They worked together in companionable silence most of the time, but gradually she'd begun to learn pieces of his story. He'd been born in this valley before the army forced his people onto the reservation. His mother had been White Mountain Apache, his father a Mexican trader who'd stayed long enough to teach Joseph Spanish and give him his mixed heritage. The mission school had come later, when he was 12, and the soldiers rounded up all the Apache children they could find. They wanted to kill the Indian in us. Joseph had explained one afternoon as they worked side by side in the garden. Cut our hair, forbade our language, beat us for practicing our ceremonies, but they could not take this. He touched his chest, over his heart. They could not take who we are inside. Sarah Beth had found herself sharing her own stories in return. Her childhood in Missouri, her parents' death from fever, her marriage to David Mackenzie, who'd been kind but weak, too trusting with money and too fond of the bottle after a hard day in the mines. I think I knew he would die young, she'd admitted. He had that look about him, like he was already part way to somewhere else, but he was gentle with me, and that seemed like enough at the time. Gentleness is not small thing, Joseph had replied. Many women do not have even that. This morning was different, though. Sarah Beth woke to the sound of horses approaching the valley, multiple horses, moving fast. Joseph was already up, standing at the front window with his rifle in his hands. "Stay in the back room," he said quietly. "Keep Thomas quiet." Sarah Beth's heart lurched. "What is it?" "Men from town. They have been asking questions." Before she could ask what kind of questions, the riders crested the ridge and started down into the valley. Sarah Beth counted 6 men, led by Sheriff Coleman, who she recognized from her time at the train station. Behind him rode Buck Morrison and his associates, along with 2 other men she didn't know. "Joseph Rising Sun," Sheriff Coleman called out as they approached the house. "We need to talk." Joseph stepped onto the porch, the rifle held casually but ready. "Sheriff, got reports you're harboring a white woman and her child," Coleman said, dismounting. "That true?" "What business is that of yours?" Buck Morrison spurred his horse closer. "Told you this was our business, Apache. Got laws about your kind keeping white women." "What laws?" Joseph's voice remained calm, but Sarah Beth could see the tension in his shoulders. Sheriff Coleman looked uncomfortable. "Now, Joseph, you know it ain't proper. White woman living with an Indian man, it don't look right. People are talking. What people say is not my concern." "Well, it's mine," Morrison snarled. "I had a deal with that woman. She owes me." Sarah Beth's blood turned to ice. Through the crack in the door, she could see Morrison's face twisted with anger and something worse. Thomas stirred in her arms, and she prayed he wouldn't cry. "The woman owes you nothing," Joseph said quietly. "Like hell." Morrison dismounted and started toward the porch. "She agreed to come work for me, then ran off like a thief in the night. I got expenses, preparations I made. She's gonna honor her agreement or pay me back." "What kind of work?" Joseph asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. Sheriff Coleman cleared his throat. "Now, Buck, you never said nothing about no agreement when you came to me. You just said there was a white woman living inappropriate with an Indian." Morrison's face flushed red. "What's inappropriate about it? I'm offering her honest work, clean room and board. Better than shacking up with some savage in the wilderness." The word hung in the air like a slap. Sarah Beth saw Joseph's knuckles whiten on the rifle, saw the careful stillness that had settled over him. "You will leave now," Joseph said, his voice deadly quiet. "I don't think so." Morrison signaled to his men, who began to spread out around the house. "Sheriff, I want you to search that house. Bring out the woman and her bastard child so we can sort this out proper." "Buck, I can't just—" "You can and you will." Morrison's voice rose to a shout. "Or maybe you want to explain to the territorial governor why you're letting white women get violated by Apache bucks." Sarah Beth felt sick. She could see what was happening, how Morrison was twisting the situation to force the sheriff's hand. Sheriff Coleman was a decent man, but he was also a politician who couldn't afford to look soft on what Morrison was framing as a racial issue. "Joseph," Coleman said reluctantly, "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. Let me talk to the woman. Make sure she's here of her own free will. She is. Then she can tell me herself." Before Joseph could respond, Thomas chose that moment to let out a loud wail. The sound carried clearly across the yard, and Morrison's face split into a triumphant grin. "There's your proof, Sheriff. Now do your damn job." Sheriff Coleman sighed and started toward the porch. "Joseph, don't make this harder than it has to be." Joseph didn't move. "You will not enter my home." I'm not asking your permission." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Sarah Beth could see Morrison's men shifting restlessly, hands drifting toward their weapons. Thomas was crying harder now, and she knew she had to do something before this escalated into violence. "It's all right, Joseph," she called through the door. "Let me talk to them." Sarah Beth. No. But she was already moving, settling Thomas against her shoulder and walking to the front door. When she stepped onto the porch beside Joseph, she felt rather than saw his sharp intake of breath. "Sheriff Coleman," she said, proud that her voice stayed steady. "I remember you from the train station." Coleman touched his hat brim. "Ma'am, Mrs. Mackenzie, is it?" "It was. I'm a widow now." "Yes, ma'am, I'm sorry for your loss." Coleman glanced at Morrison, who was practically vibrating with impatience. "Ma'am, I need to ask, are you here against your will? Has this man threatened or coerced you in any way?" Sarah Beth looked directly at Morrison as she answered, "Joseph has been nothing but kind to me and my son. He saved us from men who meant us harm, and he's asked nothing in return." "That's a lie," Morrison exploded. "She agreed to work for me, had a contract." "I had no contract with you, Mr. Morrison," Sarah Beth said clearly. "I told you no, you wouldn't accept that answer. Now see here, you little buck." Sheriff Coleman's voice held a warning. "Watch your mouth in front of the lady." Nah, Morrison's face was purple now. "Lady. She's a whore, living in sin with a damn Apache, probably spreading her legs for half the reservation." The words hit Sarah Beth like physical blows, but before she could respond, Joseph moved. In one fluid motion, he'd set down his rifle and stepped off the porch, covering the distance to Morrison in 3 long strides. "You will not speak of her that way," Joseph said, his voice deadly calm. Morrison's hand went to his gun, but Joseph was faster. His fist connected with Morrison's jaw with a sound like an axe hitting wood, and Morrison went down hard, blood streaming from his mouth. "That's enough!" Sheriff Coleman shouted, drawing his own weapon. "Joseph, step back!" But Morrison's men were already drawing, and Sarah Beth saw how quickly this was going to turn into a bloodbath. Without thinking, she stepped between them, Thomas still in her arms. "Stop!" she cried. "All of you, just stop!" The men froze, weapons half drawn, staring at the woman with a baby standing in the middle of their standoff. "Sheriff Coleman," Sarah Beth said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard, "I am here of my own free will. Joseph has never threatened me, never asked me for anything I wasn't willing to give. I am not being held against my will, and I'm not working as a prostitute. I'm a widow trying to care for my child, and this man offered me safe shelter when I had nowhere else to go." She turned to look at Morrison, who was struggling to his feet, his mouth still bleeding. "As for you, Mr. Morrison, I told you no. In a civilized society, that should be enough." Morrison spat blood and glared at her. "Civilized? You're living with a savage. Your own kind won't have nothing to do with you after this." "My own kind?" Sarah Beth felt something hot and fierce rise in her chest. "My own kind left me to starve on a train platform with a sick baby. My own kind offered to help only if I'd sell my body for it. This savage, as you call him, gave me food and shelter and asked nothing in return. He's shown me more kindness and respect than any white man I've known except my late husband." The words rang across the valley like a bell. Sheriff Coleman holstered his weapon, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "you understand what folks will say? About you living here with him? I understand that people will always find something to say, Sheriff. The question is whether you're going to arrest someone for kindness or whether you're going to arrest the men who threatened a widow and her child." Coleman looked from Sarah Beth to Joseph to Morrison, who was still glowering and spitting blood. Finally he sighed. "Buck, you and your boys mount up. I don't see any crime being committed here." "What?" Morrison's voice cracked with outrage. "You can't be serious." "Serious as a heart attack. The lady says she's here of her own free will, and I believe her. You got no contract, no legal claim. Time for you to go." Morrison looked like he wanted to argue further, but something in the sheriff's tone warned him off. He mounted his horse with jerky, angry movements. "This ain't over," he snarled at Sarah Beth. "You think you can make a fool of Buck Morrison and just walk away? You think wrong." Sheriff Coleman's hand went back to his gun. "Buck, I better not hear about you bothering these folks again. You understand me?" Morrison didn't answer, just spurred his horse and rode hard out of the valley, his men following. Sheriff Coleman remained behind for a moment, looking troubled. "Ma'am," he said to Sarah Beth, "I hope you know what you're doing. Territory's changing, but some folks' minds change slower than others." "I know, Sheriff, thank you for being fair." Coleman nodded and turned to Joseph. "You watch yourself, Joseph. Buck Morrison's got a long memory and a mean streak." "I will remember," Joseph replied. After the sheriff rode away, Sarah Beth and Joseph stood together on the porch, watching the dust settle in the evening air. Thomas had finally stopped crying and was looking around with bright, curious eyes. "Are you all right?" Joseph asked quietly. Sarah Beth considered the question. Was she all right? Her reputation in town was probably ruined. Morrison would spread his poison wherever he could. People would whisper and point and make assumptions about her moral character. But standing here in this peaceful valley, with this good man beside her and her son healthy in her arms, she realized something. She didn't care. "Yes," she said, surprised by how much she meant it. "I'm all right." Joseph nodded, then bent to pick up his rifle. "They will come back. Morrison? Maybe. Or others like him. Word will spread." Sarah Beth looked out at the hidden valley, at the life she'd begun to build here, and felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. "Let them come," she said quietly. "This is our home now." Joseph looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his dark eyes. "Yes," he said finally, "it is." 2 months had passed since Morrison's visit, and autumn was painting the canyon walls in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Sarah Beth had fallen into the rhythm of life in the valley as naturally as breathing. She tended the garden, preserved vegetables for winter, and learned to weave on Ayana's loom. Thomas was thriving, sitting up on his own now and babbling cheerfully at the horses when Joseph brought them in for evening grain. But the outside world had not forgotten them. The whispers had started in Copper Creek and spread like wildfire through the territory. A white woman living with an Apache man. Decent folk shook their heads and wondered what the world was coming to. The more charitable assumed she was being held against her will. The less charitable made assumptions about her moral character that would have made Buck Morrison proud. Sarah Beth learned about the gossip from Maria Santos, the Mexican woman who ran the general store and was the only person in town who would still trade with Joseph. Maria came to the valley once a month to buy the beautiful baskets and weavings that Joseph made from traditional Apache patterns his mother had taught him. "They say you have been bewitched," Maria told her with a sad smile as they sat drinking coffee on the porch. "That he has used Indian magic to make you forget your proper place." Sarah Beth nearly choked on her coffee. "Bewitched? It is easier for them to believe that than to think a white woman might choose to live with an Apache because he is a good man," Maria explained. "They cannot accept that their own kind failed you when you needed help." That evening, as Sarah Beth prepared supper, she found herself thinking about Maria's words. She watched Joseph through the kitchen window as he worked with one of the horses, his movements patient and gentle as he taught the young mare to accept a halter. Everything about him spoke of quiet strength, of a man who had survived terrible losses without letting them harden his heart. When had she fallen in love with him? She couldn't pinpoint the exact moment. Maybe it was the first night, when he'd given her safety without asking for anything in return. Maybe it was the morning she'd woken to find him sitting by Thomas's cradle, watching over her sleeping son with protective tenderness. Or maybe it was the day she'd cut her hand on a broken jar and he'd bandaged it with such gentle care, his dark eyes soft with concern. "Sarah Beth?" She turned to find Joseph standing in the kitchen doorway, Thomas on his hip. Her son had taken to Joseph immediately, reaching for him with delighted squeals whenever he appeared. Joseph, in turn, seemed to find a quiet joy in caring for the child, often carrying him while he did chores, or singing to him in Apache when Thomas was fussy. "Supper's almost ready," she managed, trying to ignore the way her heart raced when she saw them together. Joseph studied her face with those perceptive eyes. "You are troubled. Maria told me what people are saying in town." Joseph's expression didn't change, but she saw his shoulders tense slightly. "And what are they saying?" "That you've bewitched me. That I'm not here of my own free will." "And what do you think?" The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Sarah Beth looked at this man who had become her anchor, her safety, her home, and realized she couldn't hide from the truth any longer. "I think," she said carefully, "that they're right about one thing. I'm not the same woman who came here 4 months ago." Joseph set Thomas in his wooden high chair and moved closer. "How are you different?" "I'm stronger, happier. I'm not afraid anymore." She took a breath. "And I'm in love with a man I never expected to love." The words hung in the air between them. Joseph went very still, his dark eyes searching her face. "Sarah Beth." "I know," she said quickly. "I know it's complicated. I know what it would mean, what people would say. I know I'm probably foolish to think." Joseph crossed the remaining distance between them in 2 strides and cupped her face in his hands. "You think I have not noticed. You think I do not see how you look at me, how you care for this place, for me. But your wife, Ayana, is gone," Joseph said gently. "She died loving me, and I will always carry that love in my heart. But she would not want me to die with her. She would want me to live, to find happiness again." Tears spilled down Sarah Beth's cheeks. "And do you want that?" Instead of answering with words, Joseph leaned down and kissed her. It was gentle and careful and full of promise, tasting of hope and new beginnings. When they broke apart, Sarah Beth felt like she could fly. "I love you," Joseph said simply. "I have loved you since the day you chose to trust me instead of running. I love your courage, your kindness to my people's ways, the way you sing to Thomas when you think no one is listening." "And I love you too," Sarah Beth whispered, then kissed him again, deeper this time, full of all the longing she'd been carrying. From his high chair, Thomas clapped his hands and babbled approvingly, making them both laugh. "I think he approves," Sarah Beth said, wiping her tears. "He is wise for such a small person," Joseph agreed, then grew serious again. "But Sarah Beth, if we choose this path together, there will be consequences. The town, the territorial government, perhaps even the federal authorities. Marriage between Apache and white is not legal in many places." Sarah Beth felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" "I mean that loving each other and living together may not be enough to protect us, or Thomas." Before Sarah Beth could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the valley. But this time, it wasn't angry men from town. It was a single rider, moving slowly and calling out in Spanish. Joseph tensed, reaching for his rifle, but Sarah Beth recognized the voice. "It's Maria." They went out to meet her, and Sarah Beth immediately saw that something was terribly wrong. Maria's usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, her dark hair escaping from its bun, her face pale with fear. "Joseph, Sarah Beth," she gasped as she dismounted. "You must leave. Tonight." "What's happened?" Joseph demanded. "Morrison. He has been to the territorial capital, to Santa Fe. He has convinced them that you are holding a white woman and child against their will, using them for immoral purposes." Maria's voice broke. "They are sending soldiers, federal cavalry, with orders to arrest you and take Sarah Beth and the baby into protective custody." Sarah Beth felt the world tilt around her. "When?" "Tomorrow. Maybe the next day. Morrison is leading them here himself." Joseph's face had gone stone still. "How do you know this?" "My cousin works at the telegraph office. The orders came through today. Joseph, they mean to hang you." The words hit Sarah Beth like a physical blow. "No, No, there has to be something we can do. I'll tell them the truth. I'll explain. You think they will believe you? Maria shook her head sadly. Morrison has told them you are suffering from what he calls Indian madness, that you have been brainwashed and cannot be trusted to tell the truth. They will take you away to a sanatorium until you recover your proper thinking. And Thomas? Maria's silence was answer enough. Sarah Beth felt panic clawing at her chest. They can't. He's my son. He is the child of a white woman who has been living with an Apache, Maria said gently. They will place him with a proper Christian family. Over my dead body, Sarah Beth snarled, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. Joseph was already moving, his warriors' training taking over. How many soldiers? 20, maybe more. Morrison brought federal marshals too. We can't fight that many, Sarah Beth said, but even as she spoke, she saw something dangerous and determined in Joseph's eyes. We cannot fight them here, he agreed, but there are other ways. What do you mean? Joseph looked at her for a long moment, then at Thomas, who was watching them with wide, serious eyes from the doorway where he was learning to pull himself upright. My mother's people have a place in the mountains, hidden deeper than this valley. The soldiers cannot reach it, do not know it exists. We could disappear, live as my ancestors did. You're talking about running. I'm talking about surviving, about keeping our family together. Our family. The words sent warmth through Sarah Beth's chest, even as her mind raced through the implications. But your home, your ranch, is nothing compared to losing you and Thomas. Sarah Beth looked around the valley that had become her sanctuary, at the house where she'd found love and peace, at the garden she'd helped plant and tend. The thought of leaving it all behind made her heart ache. But the thought of losing Joseph, of having Thomas taken from her, of being locked away in some sanatorium until she recovered her proper white woman's sensibilities, that was unbearable. There's something else, she said quietly. Both Joseph and Maria looked at her. I never told you why I was really running from that banker in Prescott. It wasn't just because of his previous wives. Joseph frowned. What do you mean? Sarah Beth took a deep breath. Thomas isn't David's son. The words fell into the evening air like stones into still water. Joseph went very still. The banker, Edmund Pierce, he forced himself on me when I came to beg for more time to pay the debt. He said it was the price of his patience. I was so ashamed, so desperate, I didn't tell anyone. When I realized I was pregnant, I let David think the baby was his. He was so happy. Tears were streaming down her face now. Don't you see? If they take me back, if they investigate, Pierce might realize Thomas is his. He's a wealthy, connected man. He could claim the baby, take him away from me legally. Joseph stepped closer, his face gentle. And you think this changes something between us? Doesn't it? Thomas isn't. I mean, he's not. He is the child you carried, the child you love, the child you have protected with your life, Joseph said firmly. That makes him yours. That makes him ours. Sarah Beth felt something break open in her chest, a knot of shame and fear she'd been carrying for months. You don't care? I care that you were hurt. I care that you were alone and afraid. I care that you have carried this burden by yourself. Joseph reached out and touched her face gently. The rest does not matter. Maria cleared her throat softly. If you are going to leave, it must be now. They will come by morning. Joseph nodded and turned to Sarah Beth. It will be hard. The mountain trails, winter coming. No guarantee of safety. Sarah Beth looked at the house where she'd found happiness, at the man who offered her unconditional love, at her son who deserved to grow up free and protected. When do we leave? Joseph's smile was like sunrise. 1 hour. Take only what we need to survive. As they rushed to pack, Sarah Beth felt fear and excitement warring in her chest. They were leaving behind everything they'd built, stepping into an uncertain future, with winter approaching and enemies behind them. But they were doing it together. They were doing it as a family. An hour later, as they led their horses up the hidden trail that would take them deeper into the Apache stronghold, Sarah Beth looked back once at the valley that had saved her life. Then she turned her face toward the mountains and the unknown future that awaited them. Behind her, she could hear Thomas babbling contentedly from his secure position in the carrier on Joseph's back. Ahead of her, stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, lighting their path toward freedom. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And that, Sarah Beth realized, was all she had ever really wanted. A family of her own choosing, built on love instead of duty, held together by choice instead of law. The secret that had brought her shame had become the key to her liberation. And as they climbed higher into the protective embrace of the mountains, Sarah Beth finally understood that sometimes the greatest courage was not in staying and fighting, but in knowing when to walk away from a world that would never accept the love you'd found. In the distance, she could hear the cry of a nighthawk, wild and free. Soon, she thought, they would be wild and free too.